Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
So this flight is going to Vaikuntha. Yes, please.
Hare Krishna, everybody. Welcome to our Friday evening program. We're so really honored and grateful to have H.D.Goswami with us, also known as Dr. Renzik. Maharaj is such a really inspiration.
Hey, Leelananda.
He's been one of the founders of the Krishna House, one of the pioneers of the Hare Krishna movement. He is a scholar and a teacher and a PhD in Sanskrit and Indian studies from Harvard University. He's commentated on many scriptures, he's written many articles, presented at many universities, many institutions around the world for many, many years. And today we have a really engaging and interesting topic, which Maharaj suggested himself, called the false versus the real revolution. And so without any further ado, please a lot of round of applause for Also, feel free to move closer.
Yes, I'm unarmed. You
Plenty of space.
So thank you all for coming. Nowadays, when I use a word like revolution, I think I'm dating myself. I did most of my undergraduate work at UC Berkeley, and I actually arrived there kind of right on the sort of rode the wave. I got there just when everything was really starting to explode there in Berkeley, and participated in a lot of those events. Actually, my brother and I, my older brother was also a student at Berkeley, and our picture appeared on the front page of the Oakland Tribune in the middle of a riot. So when I was young, I mean, the word revolution was very positive. And of course, then the Beatles did that, I think, really brilliant song called Revolution. They talked about the limits of revolution. What is it? There for you, what was a false revolution? So I don't really know today the exact sort of sociocultural status of the word. I don't think it's as positive as it was back then. But the word revolution, in the sense that I'm using it, is not the sense of the violent overthrow of a government, but rather, like they say, for example, a revolution in marketing or something. That an event or a process or a trend that dramatically changes the way people do something or the way they perceive something. So nowadays, not only nowadays, but really for a few decades now, every time they do a survey, which they seem to do a lot, asking people if they think America is going in the right direction, and there's usually a very strong majority that say no. And it's funny, because really for the last 20 years at least or more, you have constantly these surveys that a strong majority of Americans think the country is going in the wrong direction, but no one thinks it's their fault, which is interesting. In any case, come on in. In any case, it is a fact we live in a time where many people, probably most people, are aware that things are not going well for our civilization. Even the efficacy, the viability of democracy is being called into question. There's been sort of a collapse of moral standards. And of course, the so-called leaders, politicians are definitely leading the way in the sort of the war against decency. And so I remember back in the 50s, I was born really just, well, 3 years after World War II ended and atomic bombs fell and all that. And so I grew up in a time of for one thing, great patriotism, and because the war had just ended. And there was when I became old enough to realize what was going on in the world, there was a very strong belief throughout the nation in progress, that the future would be better than the present or the past, and that practically by from what I saw back as a child, by 1970, we all should have been flying around with rocket packs on our back. And all kinds of machines which saved us from the danger of getting any exercise. So, but the future. I remember when I was 16 years old, I flew to back east. I grew up in California, and I flew back east. The side of our family lived out there, and so one of the places I went to was New York, and I went to the World's Fair. That was in 1965. There was a great World's Fair in New York, in Flushing Meadows, which then became, I think, the end of the airport. Went to the World's Fair, everything was progress, everything was the future. No one had any doubt that the future would solve all problems. And so the reason I'm bringing all this up is because it's not exactly like that now. So that, for example, if you're in college now, there's not that confidence, that sort of utopian idealism, that we can change the world, we can make everything better, and the future will absolutely be better than the past. So, as we know, the world's not like that now. And so the word revolution, the way I wanted to use it, is not to advocate some type of violent action against some regime, but rather that since a strong majority of people are keenly aware that the world and this country are not in a good place, and that maybe there's some hope still that something might be done, or even something dramatic might be done, maybe there could be a renewal of hope and of a society that actually has a purpose worth the name. So in that spirit, revolution. And of course, as we know, if you look at history, if you're a student of history, which I've always been, you know that most of the time when people have big ideas and think they're going to make the world a much better place, it ends up not doing that. And often society goes backwards. So therefore, I think for anyone that really cares about their own life or cares about the planet we happen to be on right now, and if you care about other people, it's worth taking a little time to discuss, according to history and social science and even philosophy and spirituality, what is likely to work to really save this poor planet and what is very likely not to work. As they say, that old definition of insanity, doing the same thing, expecting a different result. When you study history, you realize there are things that people might do on a much bigger stage, like attempts to make the world a better place. And in the 20th century, most of the really enthusiastic, totally committed attempts to make the world a better place resulted in genocide. So the 20th century is definitely a cautionary tale, as they say. So I'm going to launch now into my talk. And so if you talk about, let's say, changing the world dramatically, making the world dramatically better, seriously better than it is now, of course we have to know what the problem is. And I think the first huge mistake we have to avoid, because like I said, in the 20th century, it basically resulted in genocide, both on the left and the right. We had the Nazis who were very ideological. They had an ideology. They thought that you don't have to really go out and study the world. You don't have to know history. You don't have to know people. You certainly don't need empathy. You just need an ideology, a material ideology, not a spiritual one. And then basically you kill everyone that doesn't agree with you. And what's interesting is that Hitler was a big fan, and this is documented, of an English gentleman named Charles Darwin. Hitler and many of the Nazi leaders believed, and this is kind of hushed up in university classes because you're supposed to think that Darwin only brought good to the world. But actually, the Nazis believed they were carrying out a Darwinian project, survival of the fittest. They just believed that the fittest were the great Teutonic race of Germany, and we all know what happened. What often is not taught in universities, because it's not ideologically convenient, is that another group of people with another ideology killed between 10 and 20 times more people than Hitler. I mean, that's impressive in an evil way. They killed between 10 and 20 times more people than Hitler. And of course, those were people who claimed to be following Karl Marx. And even though that's a historical fact, if you look at the national genocide in Cambodia, the tens of millions of people murdered in the Soviet Union, and you just go down the list, China, we're up in the tens of millions. So therefore, I think what we need is not merely an ideology, because they don't have a good track record. And these were utopian ideologies. These were utopian ideologies, make the world perfect. So, but there has to be some kind of spiritual inspiration. For one thing, take democracy, for example. I mean, it's a big mistake to think that a system will save the world. Systems don't do anything. Systems are always in the hands of human beings who have free will. For example, I spent a lot of time in Latin America when I was younger. And one thing I noticed about the countries down there is that they have great constitutions. They just don't follow them. But they really have good, very impressive constitutions, but the government doesn't follow it. The government just basically, there's a lot of corruption, like we have in America now too. And so if you study history, what you find is that ideologies or systems, like you can talk about monarchy or oligarchy or democracy or constitutional monarchy, absolutist monarchy. There's no system in the history of the world that was able to overcome all of the evils of a corrupt population. And by corrupt population, I mean people who are habitually selfish, dishonest, vain, because any system can be corrupted. It takes about 30 seconds. Systems don't save the world. If you have a combination of an equitable, a fair, a noble system, and you have some practical method to make people good, a practical method to actually foster virtue, honesty, generosity, compassion. So how do you do that? Marx just thought that, people will be so enamored with all the benefits of a Marxist paradise that they'll just do the right thing. It turns out they didn't. Of course, Marx himself, by the way, and Engels, they did, in their writings, justify genocide. So that was a little glitch in the system. But even if you take, for example, India, which has this extraordinary culture. India is the only country on earth which has preserved a sacred, learned tradition for thousands of years. People in Greece don't worship Zeus nowadays. And so this powerful culture in India, but of course we know there's a tremendous amount of corruption. There's a history behind that. 1,000 years of colonial rule and oppression, and weird things happen. So you can have any system. It can be the Hindu system. It can be Marxism. It can be a kingdom of Christ on earth. And you get incredible corruption and cruelty. I mean, think back. Some people think environmentalism is the answer. Seriously? I mean, environmentalism is necessary, but not sufficient. And the obvious proof is that before the Industrial Revolution, people lived on an organic planet. The whole planet was organic. And there was mind-boggling cruelty, violence, torture, killing on an organic planet. The whole planet was certified organic. So therefore, all these things, environmentalism, Marxism, even democracy, which we're witnessing now, this extraordinary corruption of democracy. I mean, America practically has become a plutocracy, ruled by the rich. And so what is the real solution? Some people think the solution is to balkanize the country and to demand that everyone strongly identify with their bodily identity. That can be ethnic, it can be racial. Now the problem is that the body, our material body, is an animal body. We also have human intelligence, which some people actually access. Not really a popular sport nowadays. So we do have this higher intelligence. We are capable of self-realization. We are capable of spiritual enlightenment in this world, or just past the Bud Light. So we're capable of that, but the body itself is full of, there's sex desire. In fact, Freud, who desperately needed a good psychiatrist, the story of Freud. They had these great systems in the 19th century, in the 20th century, where, like, for example, Marx, all human behavior can be explained by economics, which of course is absurd because human motivations are much more complex than that. And what was his motivation? I mean, he didn't think he'd get rich doing what he was doing. So if Marx is right, everything he said was motivated by economics, which would contradict everything he said. Or Freud, everything was motivated by either by lust, sex desire, or by this primitive id that's bubbling up in order. So this attempt to have these unitary concepts of human motivation, which are all superficial and all turned out to be nonsense. You cannot reduce human motivation down to sex desire. You cannot reduce it down to economic self-interest. You cannot reduce it down to one of the popular theories now, and this is coming from Marx and his cronies and neo-Marxists, that every human relation is just a power struggle. So when I was a kid in high school and I thought I was falling in love with the class secretary, it was really just about power. I wanted to subjugate her and impose the patriarchy. It wasn't that I was just totally DUI on love endorphins. But I was really it was just power relations and everything, So all these sort of like knuckleheaded attempts to reduce the tremendous complexity of human psychology and behavior down to one simple motivation was absurd, and it led to all kinds of nonsense. So, if you ask the question, since it's an obvious fact that no system of government will produce a just society, a society of compassion, of justice, and so on, by itself, if the people in that society are selfish and greedy and lusty and cruel. So therefore, the real question is not just to have these 20th century arguments about political systems, although, you know, we do a little bit of that. The real point is, how do you have a society which systematically produces good people, virtuous people, that prefer not to cheat, not to steal, not to rape, not to kill. People who actually are capable of honoring a social contract, which of course our politicians are totally incapable of. Because, you know, they're greedy for power, and anyway, I'm not used to talking about politicians, I'll spoil your appetite. So, how do you do that? Now, why not look at history? If we look at history, there are cases of very cruel societies and very unjust societies, and there are examples of just societies, of compassionate societies. And so, if we look at the good ones, what was going on? What motivated them? How did they transmit to their children and those people to their children ethical behavior, compassion, and all that? Well, I mean, let's not look for a utopia, because we're not going to find one, but to the extent that there have been societies which were reasonably concerned with justice and compassion, what we find is that their ethical codes came from something like religion. And of course, because religion is very powerful, when it's misused and corrupted, it can become an instrument of the greatest evil. We know that too. I'd like to give one example of a society that I think achieved a significant moral plateau. and of course, I could quote from our sacred books, which are thousands of years old, but people could say, well, you know, that's a sectarian religious text. I don't think it is, but let's go to a third-party observer. So I want to talk about India about 23 or 2,400 years ago, roughly. And the source of information is not coming from, of course, it was a non-secular society. There were no secular societies until the American Revolution. And so the separation of church and state did not mean, certainly didn't mean in America, if you actually know colonial history and the history of the Revolutionary period, it never meant a separation of God and country. It meant separation of church and state, meant a simple thing: no state church. No state church. In the Constitutional Convention, when they couldn't agree, and it looked like the whole thing was going to unravel, and they fought against England for no purpose, because and in the Federalist Papers, they talked about this a lot. One of the main reasons for a federal system and not a confederacy, which means power is in the states and not in the central government, is they said that, you know, we'll quarrel and European powers will pick us apart and we'll end up back where we started. So anyway, so in the Federalist Papers, they were very concerned, like, how do we unite, and so they couldn't agree. And if they didn't agree, they would be very easy victims of European powers. So it was a very serious situation. I mean, their lives were at stake, because these constitutional delegates, they'd be the first to be executed if things went, you know, off the tracks. And so Benjamin Franklin stood up and he said, the reason we can't agree, the reason we can't form a country is very simple. We've forgotten God. And so they stopped the debate and everyone just prayed to God. And when that was over, they found they could agree and they formed a country. So I'm just mentioning that because, of course, who bothers to read history nowadays when you could, you know, you have 3 unanswered texts on your phone. So anyway, if you look back at, I mean, it's interesting, the topic of the formation of the American state, and anyway, but that's another day. So if you look at India 2,300 years ago, we have a third-party witness. That third-party witness is a gentleman named Austerity. He was a Greek ambassador to India. The Greek ambassador. And the Greeks tend to be very ethnocentric. They thought they were like, you know, basically God's gift to the planet. But Megosthenes wrote a book called Indica, about India. And he describes this country, which is extraordinary. For one thing, it was the only country back then, and perhaps the only country since then, where they had very powerful rules about animal rights. The notion of compassion was not only extended to human beings, it was extended to animals. They had animal hospitals almost 2,500 years ago in India. As far as human beings, Megosthenes says that basically you can walk across a subcontinent with practically no fear of crime, because there's almost no crime. People respect each other. If you're a foreigner, he said, and he was, if you're a foreigner in India, not only will you not be taken advantage of by the locals, but the government has special laws and special procedures and agents to make sure that no visitor to the country is ever cheated or mistreated. And here's something which is extraordinary, which was never replicated in Europe or other places. On the one hand, it's a country which was deeply rooted in spiritual values and yet had complete freedom of religion. India always had freedom of religion, except when it was ruled by Muslims and Christians. So there's freedom of religion, freedom of speech. To give one example of the extraordinary degree of freedom of speech and of religion, around that time when Megosthenes wrote his book, there were 2 new religions spreading in India very rapidly. They were sort of homegrown new religions. One was Buddhism and one was Jainism, which back in the day was very big, like Buddhism. And then, anyway, things happened. So, now the Buddhists, let's just look at the Buddhists. They were Indians. I mean, this was all indigenous. Buddha is a Sanskrit word, you know, the awakened one. And so the Buddhists were totally trashing the most sacred scriptures in India, which were the Vedas. And the Buddhists kind of built their marketing strategy on saying the Vedas aren't where it's at. You know, forget the Vedas. So if you were in Europe, let's say, once it became Christian, and you went around on street corners saying that the Bible's nonsense, your life expectancy probably would be measured in seconds. And the same is still true today in Muslim countries. So here you have this philosophical revolution, and yet no one's killed because you have freedom of speech. Even though the Vedas are the holy of holies, most sacred books, you have the right to criticize them because there's freedom of speech. To give an example from the Mahabharata, the great ancient history of India. Not exactly third party, but it's a great ancient history of India. And there's one particular scene where the king, the Kuru king, who was the most powerful king at the time, Dhritarashtra, which literally means he was clinging to the throne, Dhritarashtra, and his son was sort of your basic evil politician, Duryodhana. He wanted to assassinate the rightful claimants to the throne, who were his cousins, the great Pandavas, the 5 Pandava brothers. So therefore, in order to assassinate them, he invited them, or he had his father invite them to visit a city in their kingdom, and it's very interesting. They had all kinds of agents talk it up, like, wow, that is the most beautiful city in our kingdom, Varnavata. And you gotta see it, beautiful architecture, gardens, and so you gotta see it. If you haven't seen Varnavata, you ain't seen nothing. And so they were talking it up. So after this campaign of talking up Varnavata, then Dhritarashtra said, hey, to his nephews, who he was, helping to plan to assassinate, why don't you go visit Varnavata? You guys probably need a vacation. And so then Duryodhana, his son, who was really a bad guy, he arranged to have a special house built for them because they were princes, You can't just pick up some ordinary real estate there. We're going to build a really nice house for you. But the house was a fire trap. It was a fire trap. In fact, it's called the House of Black, Laka, in Sanskrit. It was meant to sort of go up in moments, in flames. And so, anyways, it's an amazing story because the Pandavas had one uncle, Vidura, who always would save them when they were young. And so Vidura, when they were leaving, and he discovered this plot just at that moment. And there were like thousands of people around. He couldn't warn the Pandavas because if people knew he was warning them, and there were agents all over. If you look at that ancient civilization, it's very much spy intensive. They have these very elaborate, like CIAs and FBIs and everything. And so he couldn't tell them open, so he sort of told them in sort of riddles and symbolic language, and they got the message. So anyway, so they arranged to save themselves. They arranged to set fire to the house themselves. They preemptively burned the house down, and they made it look like they died in the fire. And so when the news came, everyone in the world thought these great princes are dead. Everyone thought the princes have been killed, and people strongly suspected who had done it. But what's interesting, this gets back to the point of human rights that I was mentioning. All of the people went out to the center of the city, like the center of the city, and were openly cursing the king and his son. Openly, just criticizing them, insulting them, accusing them of being murderers. And so what happened? What would have happened in Europe or other parts of Asia if you just went out in the center of town and started saying the king is a criminal? So what happened there in this Vedic culture? The king and his son, they realized we better be careful or the citizens will throw us out of office. It's right there in the Mahabharata. In other words, it was legal. The citizens had a right to criticize the king. They had a right to criticize the state religion. And so this combination, which we haven't found in other places, with a really advanced level of spirituality within the society, and yet free of fanaticism, and respecting human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. I'm not aware, of course, someone can enlighten me if I missed something, but I'm not aware of another civilization on that level. And the civilization was so powerful that thousands and thousands of years later, because according to archaeoastronomical evidence and according to ancient inscriptions, we actually can date the appearance of Krishna in this world to roughly 5,125 years ago. I'll tell you very quickly what it is. So I read that. There's something called archaeoastronomy, which means if you read in ancient texts descriptions of the night sky, you can calculate mathematically when the sky would have looked like that to a normal human observer, about a telescope. And you can't cheat. Obviously, before the Industrial Revolution, people looked not to the future for progress, they look to the past. In the Judeo-Christian world, they look to the Garden of Eden. In India, they look to Ram Raja, the great kingdoms of the Avatar Rama or other, because what you find is in ancient civilizations, both in India, also in Greece, if you look at ancient Greek philosophers and writers, Hesiod, Homer, and so on, they understood that the ancient past, what for them was the ancient past, was much more advanced. And that actually they talk about this, just like in India, just like in the Vedas, that the earth passes through a golden age, a silver age, a bronze age, and an iron age. And so what you find is this awareness in the Greco-Roman, in the ancient civilization, that in a world which for them was ancient, the world is much more advanced and had a much more sophisticated, non-mechanical, non-metal-based technology. So in any case, so in that world back then, there was freedom and people looked to the past. Then people started looking to the future. With the Industrial Revolution and the dawn of secularism and materialism, which brings inevitably in its wake agnosticism. I mean, that's a whole other discussion. How it's sort of the inevitable socio-psychological outcome of industrialization and mechanization of everything, a mechanistic view of life itself, and materialism, philosophical materialism. But in any case, so that civilization, I'm kind of touching on many points. I'm going to try to get control of myself here and focus. So what's interesting is that civilization has survived till today and it's still very strong. In fact, if you know what's going on in India in the last 10 years, you know it's becoming stronger and stronger, which of course is totally frustrating materialist, secularists, and people that just, they think the worst thing that could happen to the world is to put at the center of its civilization, sacred tradition. Anyway, a lot of things I could say here, many of them sarcastic. So, anyway, so here we are. So one important message that, we have for you or for the world is that we're not using as guinea pigs. Marx basically turned the planet into just a bunch of guinea pigs. That's what Mussolini did. And by the way, in case you didn't know it, Mussolini in his college days was a Marxist. And so we have this picture because, of course, Hitler invaded Russia, the Soviet Union. Everyone thinks that these were totally opposing ideologies. Actually, they weren't. Fascism was a variation on Marxism, which they also don't teach you in leftist universities. But the fact is that Marx made all these prophecies, and he was not a good prophet. The working class will rise up and overthrow the shackles and blah, blah, blah. So what happened is people, at the time when Mussolini was a college student, intellectuals were beginning to notice that it didn't happen. It's like, it didn't happen. The prophecies they weren't fulfilled. And so Mussolini, as a young Marxist, was trying to understand what went wrong. How do we fix this? Because he accepted, because he was a narcissist, Mussolini, he liked the Marxist idea of dictatorship. And that is a key point in Marxism, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Anyway, I don't want to go into the whole philosophy. That is absolutely a necessary stage, and one that the thing kind of bogs down and just stays in the dictatorship of the proletariat. He liked that because he was a narcissist. He liked that he'd been able to, bully everyone, control everyone. He liked the idea of state control of production. That's cool. But what he noticed is that people are not motivated by economic class warfare. What was inspiring people back then? Nationalism. Because that was the time when recently you had the formation of the German state, which had been divided. I mean, there was no such thing as Germany until like 150 years ago. It was just the assortment of principalities. Italy was city-states. So the unification of Italy, the unification of Germany, and then of course, some of the Balkan countries, they wanted to play that game too, which of course led to World War I. Nationalism. So Mussolini saw that what really is motivating people is nationalism, which by the way was a left-wing movement back then. So he thought, let's keep Marxism, basic structure, let's just swap out the engine. It's like if you have a car and the chassis is really good, the upholstery is good, the electronics are good, but the engine's useless. You just put in a new engine. So that's what fascism was. It was just putting a new engine into Marxism. And the engine was nationalism. And that's why, and the obvious proof of that is that in the word Nazi, the Z stands for the German word for socialist. The national, I mean, that's what the Z stands for in Nazi. It's socialism. But nationalism, it's nationalist socialism. So anyway, get a little far afield. So, but the point I want to make here is that unlike these crazy, murderous ideologies, we are not using you as guinea pigs. In fact, when they were pushing, for example, in Cambodia, where they basically killed 10% of the whole population, essentially everyone that had over a high school education. So in America, there was roughly 330 million people. So imagine if a government took power and killed 33 million people in this country. That's what happened in Cambodia. So we're not using you as guinea pigs. And all these, we're saying this already works. And actually, if you try to solve the problems, the injustice, by, just forcing everyone to be their body, like you're a white male, or you're a black female, or you're a this, or you're that, or you're a Chicano, or an Asian, or just whatever kind of body you have. Because whatever kind of body you have, and insisting that people operate, that they live their lives, they make all their decisions from this intense identification with the material body. The material body is the seat of lust, greed, pride. You must remember when you were in high school, you had those very emotional moments looking in the mirror before a date, praying to God you didn't get a pimple on your nose. And so the point is that the more you identify with your body, the more you become an animal. Because that's what the body is. It's an animal body, which can be balanced by higher consciousness. So we don't rape and steal. We're not greedy. And so these so-called movements to bring justice are making things worse. Because in fact, the more you rally everyone to hate the other half of the country, and of course, I'm talking about both sides, because both sides, they try to get elected by showing the voters in their constituency that I hate the other half of the country more than my competitor. You should vote for me because there's more hatred in me. I'm more fanatical. I'm more uncompromising. So basically, the country is being balkanized, animalized by people who are going exactly the wrong direction, who think that the way to restore civilization is not by raising everyone to a platform where we're all souls. We're all part of God. It does not matter what kind of body you have, because we're all the same as souls. So if we can all come to that platform, we can love each other, we can cooperate, we can have, civilized debates about policy. So instead of lifting people to a higher common denominator, they drag everyone down to animalism. And that's why people can't cooperate. That's why they can't get together. That's why they're about to shut down the government, these morons. Because they think the solution, the way to make America great again, is animalism. And what we're saying is, America will become great the only way any country ever became great, by having a powerful spiritual center in their culture. So, and again, you're not a lab rat. You know, this actually works. You can read history. And so that's the message, basically. So before I get myself in real trouble, I'm going to stop and ask for questions. So thank you very much. Hare Krishna.
A microphone to go
Yes.
on.
Should have given trigger warning. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Resnick, for
Thank you.
the talk. So, Dr. Resnick, it looks like you don't like the identification of the material body, but I'm wondering about something, and it's about our health.
Yes.
So, if we identify with our body, we need to take care of our body. But you
Absolutely.
said that it's not good.
No. My body, of course, can't tell because of this particular body, which is getting a little ill, but our bodies are a precious gift. For example, thank God I happen to own a motorized vehicle. And that's why, I go around doing what I do. If I don't trash the car, I really take care of it. I change the oil. I'm really good to my car because I can't, in a sense, separate my self-interest from the condition of the car. This body is a divine gift. Because with this human body, we are capable not merely of copulating and fighting, we're actually capable of thinking. We're capable of self-realization. We can actually discover the most profound truths in the universe, not simply, astrophysics, but the metaphysical truths, which, as Aristotle pointed out, they're the truths that are beyond the physical truths. Like, for example, in America, we have democracy. Empirically, that's absurd. You can't find empirical equality. University of Florida has become a very competitive university, sort of like what they call a public Ivy. Most of the people that apply to this university don't get in, which would technically be impossible since we're all equal. But we're not, empirically. And yet, in forming a system of government, forming a moral system, a judicial system, America and most other developed countries subordinate every empirical fact to a physical fact, to a metaphysical truth. That even though we're physically different, metaphysically we're all equal. And therefore we all deserve equal justice, equal compassion, equal opportunity. It's right there in the Declaration of Independence. I mean, Jefferson wasn't stupid, which, at least not in every, Jefferson, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, it's a philosophical statement. He says we hold these truths to be self-evident. Self-evident is serious epistemology. Again, Aristotle, I guess it's Aristotle night tonight, but Aristotle was concerned with the real danger of stating that something is true, but being pushed into an infinite regress of proofs. Because whatever you give as evidence, they essentially say, we'll prove that, we'll prove that, we'll prove that. So Aristotle said, and actually Lord Chaitanya said the same thing, that the way you escape from an infinite regress of proof, so you can actually claim that something is evident, is true, you have to establish an epistemic foundation. And in fact, in philosophy, it's called foundationalism. which means that there is something which is true self-evidently. It proves itself, and therefore it doesn't require extrinsic verification, and that self-evident truth becomes the foundation to build a system of knowledge. To give one simple example, empirical science. Now, one possible problem, which was first raised in the West by Descartes, is how do you know there is a real physical world outside of your mind? Because as we know, when you sleep and dream, most of the time you're dreaming, you think this is real. So how do you know, how do you know there's a real physical world? And if you can't show there's a real physical world, then how can you do empirical science? So the answer, just cutting a lot of logical steps here, because you're probably getting hungry. But the fact is that the way the world presents itself, the quality of our experience of the world is such that it is self-evident to us that that this is a real world. There's a real physical world outside my mind. Let's say you're dreaming and you wake up. How do you know when you wake up you're seeing a world that's more real or as real as the world of your dream? The dream world is not available for empirical study. You can't empirically prove it. But the quality of the experience convinces you, I was dreaming, now I'm awake. That's called foundationalism. So when you try to achieve self-realization, when you try to understand yourself as an eternal soul, and it is incredibly in your self-interest to be eternal. And if there's one thing that's in your self-interest, it's being eternal. So even if you're not sure if you're eternal, explore it. Explore the possibility, because it's the only game in town if you want to survive. So I'm just gonna finish up and then you. Yeah. So we have experience. The reason I'm here, harassing you about all this stuff, is because I have experiences which are self-evident. In fact, they're almost, you could say, more self-evident than my knowledge that you really exist. It's an experience so powerful, so self-verifying, self-validating, that I would be completely irrational and foolish not to accept it. In the same way, I would be foolish to think that there's no real physical world outside my mind. So, anyway, move on to the question.
Thank you.
Yes, lady, and then yeah.
Hello. I love what you said about having a spiritual center. That is incredible. But this is Kali, and it is close to impossible to, first of all, convince people to, of course, I don't think anything that, especially those it does, requires convincing is about, you either you're guided to it or you're not. It's almost a choice.
Can I say one word about that?
Yes, please.
Fortunately, beyond Hinduism is Sanatana Dharma, eternal duty. And what we find, if you look at real Indian history, and not this tale that's told today, Shankara, for example, he went all around the country teaching his doctrine. Ramanuja, these were philosophers, and as they say, even in modern Western philosophy, the essence of philosophy is the argument. When you do philosophy, you're arguing. And they had these brilliant scholars, brilliant scholars, Ramanuja, Madhva, Shankara, and many others. So the idea that we don't try to persuade people is a new idea in India for various colonial and post-colonial reasons. So, but you're right. You correctly characterized contemporary Hinduism. It's just not Indian history.
Sure. What I want to know your opinion about this. So even spiritualism would have that spectrum,
Yes.
Where if, for example, you think about there is this there is birth, there is death. You have, you know, the Aghoris who do worship the ashes and, you know, they have their own little tribe. Their form of spiritualism is a different form of spiritualism. So what, you know, how you bind spiritualism?
Oh, okay,
You know,
very good question. You are, I really appreciate your questions, they're good questions. First of all, I think the word spiritualism has to be used more precisely. Because we want a spiritual science. And so there's a difference between, let's say, mere mysticism and true spiritualism. Mysticism, which can be spiritual, but not necessarily, so I'll define my terms. For example, as we know, in India, and every other country I've ever heard of, a lot of people, I'm tempted to say most people, engage in different kinds of religious activities hoping to get rewards, and rewards in this world. So it's mystical. For example, there's a, let's say there is a physical science, there's physics, there's chemistry, there's, you know, everything that constitutes material science. So mysticism simply says that in the taxonomy, the catalog of powers and entities in the universe, some things are not at present empirically available. Of course, I mean, you could just throw in the 95% of the universe, which is dark matter and dark energy, if you want, but that's another topic. So you can be a mystic materialist. The fact that you believe, for example, that, let's say, Mahadeva, Shiva, that, or, you know, somehow will bless me in a certain way. And you find this throughout the Mahabharata, everyone's like, you know, bothering Shiva to get some material thing and leave the poor god alone. So, but they're definitely going for material benefits. So that it's mystical in the sense that it's beyond the empirical. It's mystical, but it's mystic materialism. So the term spiritualism, I think, is appropriately used when you're actually talking about truly spiritual entities like you, the eternal soul, like God, like other very interesting things that exist on the spiritual plane. So, this is making that distinction, mystic and spiritual.
just one follow-up.
Please.
Yeah, and then I'll hand
No, I'm having a good time.
The path of spiritualism also requires you to go through incredible amount of pain. You literally have to shed.
Pain?
Yeah, I mean, you have to go through a journey where self-realization is not easy.
I've got good news for you. And that is that, I mean, what you're saying, you know, everything you're saying, there's truth in it. So, for example, if you look at the ancient Vedic culture, Mahabharata, Ramayana, Bhagavatam, everything, Gita, one key component of, let's say, mystic practice is tapasya, austerity. The word tapasya comes from the Sanskrit root tap, which means to heat or burn. And so the idea of, well, I mean, if you look at, say, go back 1,000 years or more and look at, let's say, Christian monastic traditions, I think begun by Saint Benedict. And so this idea that by self-denial, by denying yourself material pleasure, fasting, celibacy, all these sort of denying your bodily appetites, that somehow you get some kind of mystic power. And so this is a very ancient idea, and you know, I think there's something to it. However, in this age, Kali Yuga, it's already so miserable that you don't need to like pour misery on misery. And so it's said, there's a beautiful song by Lobsang Das Thakur, who lived about 500 years ago. He's a great Vaishnava songwriter. And he said that Parama Karuna, the supreme mercy, Parama Karuna Pahudvijana, the sort of medieval Bengali, the two lords, Nitai Gaura Chandra, that Krishna came as Gauranga and then Balaram came as Nitai, and with the supreme mercy, and Sabhyavatar, Sarva Avataranam in Sanskrit, that of all the avatars, Sabhyavatar Sara, they're the essence and scenery, the crown jewel of all avatars, and their process is Keval Ananda Kanta. Just bliss, just happiness. That in this age, I mean, if I ever stop, which I may not, I'm not promising anything, then you're gonna get a feast. And so by eating this delicious food, you're making spiritual progress. By singing and dancing, you're making spiritual progress. By, having conversation with good people, we're making progress. So in this age, we get a break.
Thank you.
This person over here patiently waiting.
We have one more.
Oh, yeah, we'll get around to
That's
this.
good here.
No, I'm curious to know who wants it. Yes.
There's an analogy given, I believe, by a recent translator and commentator of the books that you previously called sacred. And in the analogy, he says that there's a bag of rice on the ground, and some of it is spilled out, and the animals will come up, birds, maybe some small animals, they'll come up, take a few grains, they'll get full, and they'll go away. Whereas a human will take the whole entire bag because of greed.
So just one word in support of greed. And that is, it's generally, not really greed, but it's generally understood that with the agrarian revolution, with the cultivation of grains, which, will last literally thousands of years, grains, that it became possible to store food, and that actually made possible, well, what you call somewhat loosely civilization. Because when you have grains, you can get a larger population, obviously, then you can, hunting and gathering is extremely limited because you strip the forest of the food and you gotta move on, so it means you have very small communities, no division of labor, no specialization, no real advancement in terms of material skills. And so with the agrarian revolution, you get larger scale human society or bigger problems. But I'm I don't wanna just put down grain storage.
So my question that comes from the analogy is, we're addicted to drugs, we're addicted to our phones, all this, all that. My question for you is, knowing that animals are not having these problems, what's the problem with animalism?
Animalism, well, I think you need to watch some more nature films on YouTube. For one thing, they just, without the slightest hesitation, they rip other animals apart and eat them. For example, even such a noble species as dolphins, they have an alpha male who basically just, fights off all the other males, rapes all the women, and has, enjoys himself in that bizarre way. So, if you look at the real animal, and so the problem is, I don't want to go to extremes. I don't want to go to the extreme of being animal-like because, frankly, animals are cruel. Animals are cruel, and they're savage, and, they just tear each other apart, basically. A lot of them. On the other hand, we don't want to go to the other extreme of just becoming greedy, what's that word? Hoarding human beings, greedy, cruel. So the sweet spot in the middle is that we do develop civilization. For example, I like philosophy personally. And I'm really happy that some people wrote books and that those books are available because someone invented a printing press. And we can tolerate the fact that, for example, I could come to Gainesville and meet so many interesting people here because, I didn't have to walk from California. So I think there's a balance where you use things spiritually. So, yes, please.
Okay, thank you. So my question.
Microphone?
To put it very straightforwardly and simple. So the point here is that for a culture to thrive, it needs to be a spiritual culture in the center. But since everyone has a different idea of their spiritual culture is the most pure or this one is the best, how do we pick which one should be in the center?
See that? I knew you'd ask an interesting question. So,
Thank you.
okay, did you all hear that? Well, for one thing, as I explained, it is possible within this Krishna conscious culture to have religious plurality, and yet people don't kill each other. In other words, we can respectfully debate. I mean, any field, whether it's theology, philosophy, geology, any academic field. What if in some department at the university they made a rule that no one can criticize anyone else's theory, and no more debates? Just we all love each other, so everyone publish their papers. That's going to be the end of anything like serious scholarship. But I think there are two extremes you have to avoid. That's kind of my rule of thumb, is that find the center, don't go to extremes. So one extreme is violent sectarian religion, where for example, in Oxford, England, college town, in the middle of Oxford, there is a monument to, I think it was 3 Oxford professors of theology who were burned alive at the stake because Bloody Mary, the Queen Mary. There was a really bad time in English history. We get Henry VIII, and then and then you get a series of his descendants, where if they're Catholic, everyone has to be Catholic. If they're Protestant, everyone has to be Protestant. If you're in the wrong religion, the person who actually stopped this nonsense was Elizabeth I, which was a real contribution. But in any case, so we're not talking about that. We're talking about a culture in which you can debate theology, you can debate philosophy, which is actually good for theology. When you have open debate with mutual respect and rules of the game, then it actually advances. For example, you can ask questions, you can challenge me, and I have to come up with a good explanation. And then so you're, in a sense, forcing me to think. So we don't want to go to the extreme of religious fanaticism, but there's another kind of fanaticism. It's the, Newton said every force in the world produces an equal and opposite force, also called the pendulum effect. And of course Hegel talks about the dialectic, thesis, antithesis. So the point is that because we've witnessed many centuries of horrible, violent, murderous, cruel, religious fanaticism, which we've just kind of come out of the last few centuries, naturally people went to the other extreme of what I call fanatical, metaphysical relativism. No one is allowed to have a highest truth. No one is allowed to be more right than anyone else. And because just everybody play nice. And so what I'm saying is, if you look at the history of India, they had great debates. They really went at it, but they didn't kill each other. They didn't kill each other. They didn't abuse each other. They didn't have religious wars. They just had very intelligent, very productive debates. And those debates actually benefited all sides. For example, there was a time around maybe 2,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago, when there were these heavy debates going on between, on one you had Buddhists, and then you had, this course is later, 800 or 900 years ago, you had the followers of Shankara, who said it's all one and God is impersonal, and you had the Vaishnavas said, no, there's a supreme person, put up the applause sign, What are they called? The prompter, where are they prompter? So there was the Hare Krishna philosophy, and there was another one, there was something called Karmamamsa, the ritualists, who said, no, the path is just sort of almost agnostic ritual. So they had these really intelligent people. I mean, just to get into the game. If you just wanted to, sit down at the poker table, you had to be expert at logic. I mean, serious, formal academic logic. You had to know Sanskrit backwards, forwards, up and down. You had to know philosophy. You had to be a real scholar. And they went at it, and they debated, they criticized. And the result was that the philosophy reached a very high level, and no one was killed. And there were no wars about it. So I'm saying that's the middle, where we pursue rigor and clarity and precision by having debates with mutual respect, rather than all the nonsense that goes on nowadays. Because, so you have two kinds of fanaticism. This religion is the only way, everyone else is, goes right into the oven. And on the other side, because I come from California, and anyway, I know about that stuff. So on the other side, you have fanatic. In other words, when they say, it's all the same, everyone has an equal truth, they don't say that because they haven't reasoned their way to that conclusion. They haven't given cogent arguments. They haven't even thought about it. It's a dogma. It's just a dogma, like any other dogma. It's a fanatical dogma that you just declare with no reason, no argument, no logic, no nothing. And if that were true, and here's the sort of the hypocritical irony of it all, that let's say someone says that, no one has the highest truth, everyone just has their truth. If that were true, that would be the highest truth. So it's like never say never. It's self-contradictory. If you say there's no highest truth, that's the highest truth. So you just declare the highest truth.
So you kind of mean like the society where everyone accepts that there's a higher power, that we're all souls, and we're not these bodies, but kind of then there's a debate about the more kind of.
Yeah, and some people may say there is no higher power. I mean, because in India there were atheists. There were atheists in India. And the Buddhists actually, although Buddha was not an atheist, that's a big irony. Actually, I taught Buddhism here at the university, among other things, several years ago. And so I was teaching all these different religions in India. And it's a very famous fact that Buddha never taught atheism. And he never taught that there's no self. What he did teach is, I don't want to talk about it. But his followers, just like the followers of Shankara, and frankly, like some people in our Christian movement, it's sort of like an inevitable thing. When you have a powerful leader, you will get some followers who go beyond their teacher. They kind of become fanatical. It's a neurological type. It is actually, it's been proven. So if you have any kind of movement, you're going to get some fanatics.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll have to wrap up the questions there. Please, another round of applause for.
Thank you very much. I mean, in all sincerity, it's really a pleasure to spend time with you. Thank you.
Speed, before we continue to dinner, we should do a short closing kirtan. But before we get to that, I want to shout out all the people in the kitchen who helped cook tonight's feast. Headed by Kiran Mataji, who was the head cook. She was helped by Arita, Shruti, Kiara, Carmen, Shivani, and